All right, so today we're starting our first lesson in our quadratic unit. So we're going to talk today about a parabola, which is a particular type of shape when we talk about graphs. So a quadratic equation makes a special shape called a parabola, okay? And this is that shape right here. It's kind of like a U shape. Okay, so when we talk about quadratic equations, quadratic, that's that word that we learned when we did polynomials, right? That means it has a degree of 2. So the highest exponent you're going to see is going to be an x squared. And this whole unit is going to be about studying this one particular shape. They're really useful shapes for a lot of different reasons. They have a lot of great applications that we'll talk about in class. Okay, now the graph of a parabola, so when we graph a quadratic equation, this parabola shape, it's always symmetrical. Okay, and what that means is that it's the same on one side as it is on the other. If you sort of picture putting a mirror down the middle of this graph, it would reflect and give you exactly the opposite side, right? So it's perfectly the same on both sides. So that's what we mean when we say they're symmetrical, and that's going to be really useful to us in a few lessons when we start graphing these. Okay, so here's what the shape of this graph looks like, and here's what the equation is. Over here, we're going to make a table of values for this one. Now, anytime I make a table of values for an x squared graph, here's what I do. I always start in the middle at 0, and then I'm going to go 1, 2, 3 on one side, and -1, -2, -3 on this side. All right, and then for my y values, I'm going to plug these x values in, and again, I'm going to start in the middle. So if x is 0, y is 0 squared. Well, 0 squared is just 0, so y is 0. If x is 1, y is 1 squared. 1 squared is 1. If x is 2, then y is 2 squared. 2 squared is 4. If x is 3, then y is 3 squared. 3 squared is 9. All right, and then when I do the other half of the table, right, -1. So -1 squared means -1 times -1, which multiplies to +1. Okay, -2 squared means -2 times -2. Two negatives multiply to a +4. And then -3 squared, -3 times -3 multiplies to +9. So when you look at these numbers here, you can see that symmetry, the symmetrical part of it again, right? Here's the middle, and then notice how that's exactly the same going on both sides. Okay, so that's a really handy feature when we talk about graphing parabolas. All right, so now we're going to talk about some key features of parabolas. So the first thing is something called a vertex. Okay, and what the vertex is depending on which way your parabola goes, if it's like a U shape like this one, or if it's been flipped upside down to make an N shape like this one, your vertex is going to be either the highest or lowest point on the graph. So on this one here, it would be the highest point. On the U-shaped ones, it's the lowest point. Okay, minimum or maximum. So that's deciding, does your graph have a minimum or a maximum? Well, it's a minimum if it has a lowest point, which means your graph would have to look something like that in terms of its shape, and this would be your minimum. It's a maximum if your graph has a highest point, and your graph would be something shaped like this, where it's got a top point. Okay, so those are really easy to figure out. Then our next two things are x-intercepts and y-intercepts. Now, we've talked about these before with previous units, so this shouldn't be brand new. Okay, so x-intercepts are where the graph crosses the x-axis. Okay, and that can happen a few different ways. So it sometimes will happen where it's going to cross twice, and you'd have two intercepts like in that picture. Okay, sometimes it'll happen where it's only gonna like hit the x-axis and bounce off, and you'd only have one. But it's also possible sometimes with parabolas that you can have one that doesn't cross at all, and then it wouldn't have any x-intercepts. Okay, so those are what our x-intercepts are. And then the last one is our y-intercept, which is where the graph crosses the y-axis. All right, so that's going to be, as an example, here's my parabola. It would be this point right there where it crosses the y-axis. All right, so let's practice that a little bit with this example down here. So we're going to identify all of these key features. So the first one that I need is my vertex, and the vertex is going to be this point right there. So I want to write the coordinates of that point. Here's 0, 0. Remember, with points you run and then jump. So I'm going to run to -1 and then jump up to 8. So the coordinates of that point, -1, 8. All right, is this a minimum or a maximum? Well, this is the highest point on the graph, right? It's the highest that it ever goes. So that is a maximum point. All right, my x-intercept. So anywhere this graph crosses the x-axis, this one has 2. One of them's right here, one of them's right there. So we're going to write 2 different points. This one, to get to this point, I'm running to -3, and then I'm not jumping at all, right? So I'm running to -3 and jumping to 0. And then for our second one, I'm running to 1 and jumping to 0. So 1, 0. So this one has 2 different x-intercepts. And then the y-intercept would be this point right there where it crosses the y-axis. And the coordinates of that point, you're running 0 and then jumping 6, right? So it'd be run 0, jump 6. So one of the things you need to be really careful about is that x-intercepts and y-intercepts have zeros in them, but where the 0 goes is important, okay? So you have to make sure that you have the zeros in the right place when you're doing these. So pay attention to how far are you running and then how far are you jumping. Okay, so that is the basic features of parabolas. These are some of the things that we're going to worry about as we start looking at these. We're going to focus in on different parts of these graphs to try to figure out important information that we can get off of them.